Please turn with me to Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Now Moses was pasturing on the flock of Jethro with his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountainside of God, or mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He also said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people, who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, Certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign that it is I who I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain.
Thank you, Clay. This morning, we're going to take a little bit of a detour into a topic we've not yet touched on. And this is one of our themes for this year. One of our themes for this year is just thinking about God. And the reason this is a theme is because so much of our world is trying to make sure we don't think about God, to fill up our time with things to think about, to do other than just God. And so in order to kind of redirect this, I'd like to do some lessons on God himself, so that we can just spend time thinking about who he is, and who is this God that we worship. Now we are given a number of different images about God all through the Bible to describe his personality, to describe his mentality, his will, his characteristics. For example, Jesus describes himself as when he entered Jerusalem, he wished that he could gather the people together as a hen gathers her brood, right? Or in John's Gospel, we read about the Spirit referred to as like living water that comes out of a person. Or God himself, his appearance described by prophets as precious stones and precious jewels. But one of the very consistent images of God is that of fire. We see this all through the Old Testament. Even back in Genesis, you have when Sodom and Gomorrah is destroyed, that fire rains from heaven, from the Lord out of heaven. This idea that God rains down fire, that he's in control of fire. The author of Hebrews writes that our God is a consuming fire. And so there's this very consistent image of God as an image of fire. And what I'd like us to do now is I would like to start a series, and I don't know if it's going to be every week or not yet. We'll have to kind of see how things develop. But we're going to be looking at Moses here because something very interesting happens. Where Moses comes before God in a burning bush, and Moses is scared and frightened. He's bargaining with God. He's arguing with God. And then if you skip on over to Exodus chapter 24, at the very end of the chapter, verses 15 through 18, then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the 7th day he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So in Exodus 3, God is in a burning bush, and Moses is scared and frightened. He's timid. He's trying to get out of this. And yet, however much time passes, on the same mountain, because Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb were the same mountain, Moses goes before God, who is now a devouring fire on top of the entire mountain, and he's not frightened. He's not scared. In fact, he's confident. He stays up there for 40 days and 40 nights. In the bush, God calls to Moses, and Moses, out of curiosity, goes and sees. And on this fire, on this mountaintop, God calls to Moses once again, and Moses goes up on the mountain. What happened? What happened to Moses? What did Moses learn about God that at first he's frightened of God, and now he confidently goes before God when God is revealing himself in an even greater glory? What can we take from this between the burning bush to returning here? What did Moses learn about God that we can learn about God that can help us to approach God with confidence? That can help us to draw near to God and to begin to see him for who he really is, and not to be frightened, and not to be scared. And so that's what I'd like us to start doing, because you've got to start exactly where Moses starts, which is you've got to start with gentleness. You have to understand the gentleness of God. Now we're going to be looking at this, if you turn back to Exodus chapter 3. I'd like us first to look at the responses that Moses exhibits here. Moses exhibits a few different responses. I think 3 main responses in this section. As you go on, Moses' conversation with he and God continues on even to the next chapter, where there's more that's going on. But in the section that we're given here, there are, I think, 3 main responses. And the first response is that of curiosity. So starting in verse 2, we read, "The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned." Moses is curious. There's something going on there he doesn't quite understand, so he's going to take a closer look. And I don't think this is very unlike how people often come to God today. I'm not going to say everyone comes to God like this. There are people who come to God for many different reasons. But there are some people who come to God just out of curiosity. Want to know who is this God? What does the Bible say? They're curious about it. But Moses, his curiosity, he comes in closer and very suddenly finds himself in much deeper than he expected. So he comes out of curiosity and suddenly finds that this is not a natural phenomenon. There's not something going on where this is just a fire burning in a bush. There's a living being here. Right? That's already number one why he's getting in deeper. There's a living being here. There's a living thing in the fire. Number 2, the living thing knows him by name and calls out to him. Verse 4, Moses, Moses, and he says, here I am. So not only is there a living thing, but then it calls out to him by name, but then it warns him, verse 5, do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. So now he finds it much like a child wandering into a minefield. He has to be given very specific instructions on how to deal with this situation. Take off your sandals, you're on holy ground. Moses is already in way over his head very, very quickly and rapidly. So his curiosity then, I think, very naturally leads to fear, because God reveals himself in verse 6, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. He's afraid. The God identifies himself, and the God at first gives him the same identity that we have in Genesis, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We know that. So you see, there are two objects going deeper and deeper at work here. First is the object of Moses getting farther and farther in over his head, and then you have God first identifying himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but then in the next section identifies himself even more as I am, my real name. And Moses is afraid. He comes before God, finds himself in way over his head, and responds with fear. And I don't mean to suggest that fear is a bad response. I think it's actually a very natural response. There are many people who find themselves convicted of sin, and fear is a very natural response to understand that I stand in sin before a holy God. Moses responded with fear. Isaiah responds with fear. It's very natural. So fear, I don't mean to suggest, is a bad thing, but I do mean to suggest we don't live there all the time. Because you, again, think of the transition here. Moses in verse 6 hides his face because he's afraid to look at God. And then what happens later in Exodus? He asks to see God. He wants to see God. That's his wish, that I can see God. What happens to Moses? How can he become this person? So first he's curious, then he's afraid, and finally he begins to start bargaining. In verse 11 here, God lays out the plan. I've seen the people of Egypt, and I'm going to free them up, and I'm going to bring them to the promised land, and you, Moses, you're going to be an essential part of this. And so Moses begins to bargain. He says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Now I want you to notice his bargaining is based upon his inadequacy, which if that ever worked, we could always bargain with God and just say, who am I, right? Because you notice God doesn't say, well, no, you're adequate. Actually, God affirms him. He says in verse 12, but I will be with you. God is actually affirming, yes, Moses, you are inadequate. You are not qualified, but I will be with you. So Moses' bargaining was really a result of his fear, I believe, and finding himself in suddenly too deep. And as I said, I don't think this is unlike how many people come to God even today. Some people do come to God out of curiosity. Whether it's out of curiosity or necessity or a number of other things, when people come to God, there often is an initial sense of fear. Sometimes the fear comes before one commits themselves to Christ. Sometimes it actually comes after. Sometimes there is a sense of, what have I got myself into? Now my time is consumed. What am I going to do? I have all these obligations. I have all these things to do. People suddenly find themselves in too deep, and they actually don't know how to handle it. Right? This is also not unlike the stages of grief, right? With bargaining and acceptance and all that. But he suddenly finds himself in too deep, and he begins to bargain. But how does he change from this? That's the transition I'm so interested in. How does he go from curiosity to fear to bargaining to okay? And I think if it's not the place to start, it's one of the places you've got to start, which is you have to start with the gentleness of God. That God is a gentle God. And when you begin to look at this passage through the lens of the gentleness of God, suddenly you see it everywhere. And it makes sense. I mean, gentleness is a fruit of the Spirit. It's a part of who God is. It's a part of his very essence. He's a gentle God. It's actually the gentleness of God that drew Moses in the first place. He saw this bush that wasn't consumed. God was being gentle with physical matter. Now you may say, well, if God has a burning bush and the bush is not being consumed, that's not gentle, that's torture, right? Which I would say plants don't have feelings, so whatever, it's gentle. But it's the gentleness of God that drew him in. How is this possible? Because God is not like the Incredible Hulk. He doesn't just like accidentally overpower things. He is infinitely powerful, but infinitely gentle. He's infinitely capable. He doesn't accidentally overwhelm people and just destroy them. He's not like a child who doesn't know his own strength. He's gentle. This is the very thing that drew Moses in. And then how God handles Moses is with complete gentleness. Moses actually approaches God in total ignorance. He doesn't know he's standing on holy ground. And God doesn't sit there waiting with the detonator to blow him up. He instructs him. You're on holy ground. He's very gentle with him. Gives him guidance, gives him instructions. And then when Moses begins to respond with fear at the end of verse 6 there, how does God respond? He begins to say, I have seen the affliction of my people. That doesn't mean that God like observed it through a telescope. It means God feels this. He knows his people are suffering and he feels the suffering too. And then he begins to explain the promises. I'm going to lead them out to a land flowing with milk and honey. He tells them exactly where it is. It's the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites. It's over there. It's that land. Moses is fearful, and God responds with mercy, with kindness, gift giving, with gentleness. And then when Moses begins to bargain with God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? God says, well, I will be with you. Because gentleness, by the way, doesn't mean dishonesty. God is very aware Moses is incapable. But he gently gives him the assurance and the courage necessary to be able to do this. I will be with you. I will instruct you. See, believing that God is gentle was necessary for Moses, and it still is for us today. You have to believe in the gentleness of God. I mean, let's imagine Moses sees a burning bush and it crumbles to ashes, and he goes up before it, and out of the ashes, God calls out, Moses, Moses. How confident is Moses, 20 chapters later, going to be to go before God when God is a consuming fire? If God can't even handle a plant, how is he going to handle Moses? And if God can set a bush on fire without reducing it to ashes, can't God also lead us through trials without reducing us to ashes? And even if our trials eventually do end in our own physical deaths, can't God gently carry us over to the other side? You've got to understand the gentleness of God. Because if we don't believe in the gentleness of God, God will be nothing but terrifying. You can't approach him in any way but fear if you don't believe that he's gentle. That he knows your strengths. He knows your weaknesses. He knows, as he did with Moses, he knows where we lack knowledge. He knows how to instruct us. He's not looking for a reason to pull the trigger. He's looking for a reason to save us. And he does it all through gentleness. It's the gentleness of God that helps Moses transition from a person who, out of curiosity and finally fear, comes before this burning bush and then goes before God as he's a devouring fire on the mountaintop. But you can't really end there, because the truth is that gentleness doesn't end there either. Because gentleness has a purpose. Gentleness has a reason. The truth is that gentleness actually conquers. Gentleness is a way of overcoming. Gentleness is actually a way of causing surrender. You can't assume that just because God was gentle with Moses, that nothing happened afterward. Right? Yeah, God was gentle with Moses, but it wasn't like he was gentle with Moses and then just left Moses alone. What did he do? He slowly overcame him and conquered him. The commentator William Barclay, who is very efficient with especially Greek words and putting them in their historical context, he has an amazing book called Flesh and Spirit. If you ever find it, you should pick it up. And he talks about the fruit of the Spirit, and he goes into detail about gentleness. And he points out that that word that we translate as gentleness, sometimes as meekness, that one of its very essences is its ability to conquer. Right? Because look at Matthew 5. Who inherits the earth? The meek. They overcome. They conquer. He points to the Septuagint, and in Zechariah, there's the prophecy about Jesus entering Jerusalem humble and meek and on a donkey. What did Jesus enter Jerusalem to do? He entered to conquer, to overcome. God here is using gentleness to very slowly conquer and cause Moses to surrender. He's giving him no good reason not to surrender. Moses responds with fear, and God slowly brings him in and says, "This is my plan." He starts to bargain, and he says, "Well, you don't really have a good reason there either." Very confidently, very slowly and gently, God is overcoming and conquering Moses. Because the truth is that everyone will be conquered by God at some point. Right? There really is no not being conquered by God. I don't think we like the idea of being conquered. It seems unnatural. It's embarrassing. It's humiliating to have someone conquer us, overcome us. It belittles us. It's embarrassing. I think maybe probably worst of all, it means we have to admit that we need God. That we are not self-sufficient. That we can't do it on our own. There is no not being conquered by God. You can either be conquered by God eventually in His wrath, or you can be conquered by God now in gentleness and mercy. But God is not like us. You know, when we find that someone is afraid of us, we often want to take advantage of that, to exert power over that, to use it back against them. But God isn't manipulating us. He's being gentle with us so that He can not humiliate us, so He can bring us up onto the mountain with Him. He's being gentle with us so that, not so that we would be afraid of Him, but so that we wouldn't be afraid of Him. Because that's how Moses becomes a person who can go up onto the mountaintop when God is now a devouring fire rather than just a burning bush. God doesn't conquer us to make us afraid. He conquers us so that we wouldn't be fearful, so that we can approach Him. Gentleness, it doesn't just end with gentleness. Gentleness actually has motives, and it's to cause to surrender. There are many different ways people come to God. And if we come to God without understanding or believing the gentleness of God, He will be nothing but terrifying to us. You feel like you will be consumed. You will be consumed to ashes. Your life will be, all the fiery trials we go through, they will just do nothing but consume us. You have to understand that gentleness is a part of the very essence of God in order to be a person who can approach Him confidently, without fear. There are a number of attributes of God, and we'll get into those. But I think you've really got to start with gentleness. Because otherwise, God, the more you see of him, and the more awesome he is, and the more he transitions from a burning bush to a devouring fire, we won't be confident before him. We'll be nothing but fearful. It's kind of a short little lesson this morning, but I think this is really where you've got to start. When we want to understand who he is, who is this God that we worship? What can we think about? How can we go throughout our day dwelling on God? I think gentleness is a really good place to start. That our God is a gentle God. But gentleness doesn't just end there. Gentleness causes us to surrender. I mean, have we then been conquered by God? Have we surrendered everything to God? Or are there parts of our lives that still have yet to be surrendered to God? God isn't trying to bully us into surrendering every aspect of our life to him. He's trying to gently get us to do it. Because it's far better to be up with him on the mountain than to be away from him. Now, if you're here this morning and you would like to be baptized, we have the ability to do that. If you need prayers or you'd like to study, we would be very happy to do that for you. We are very happy to pray for people. If there's anything at all that we can do for you, please make your need known now while we stand and sing the invitation song.